Welcome back, Natural Resources. Believe it or not, we are starting our very last module for the course. This module will take us through Thanksgiving and up until Christmas break. So, this course is still one that is going to be tested with a state CTE test. So, you do need to make sure that you are completing those questions at the end of each unit. And of course, we will, at the end of everything, have a review section before your final exam. But I do want to begin today by talking about fisheries. And so today we're going to be looking at freshwater. We're going to be looking at lakes and ponds. And then we will take a look at some different types of freshwater fish. So let's go ahead and get started with a lake habitat. We're going to look at some different components of freshwater fish habitats. The lake itself, pretty much any lake, is going to be divided into 3 zones based on how deep the lake actually is. As you are going into the very edges of the lake, typically you can look down where your feet are and you can actually see some plants and grasses and things that are growing in the water at the very edge of the lake or the pond. And that's called the littoral zone. And we'll look a little bit more at that in just a second. As you go further in, you have other zones and other things that are going to be living, and we'll talk about each of those. But this diagram right here does a pretty good job of showing you kind of what those first 2 zones look like. And then we will get a little bit further into the lake when we get into the profundal zone on the within the next 3 slides. The first zone is that shallow part where you do have that rooted vegetation. You can see things that are growing through the water. The sun can shine far down enough that things can actually photosynthesize, so you will see some vegetation in that particular part. Where that rooted vegetation ends is pretty much where this zone ends. And it really has a lot to do with photosynthesis and how far the light can actually reach down into the water. So when you get to a point where the light can no longer reach down into the water and photosynthesis is no longer taking place, that's when you're getting into the next zone, which is the limnetic zone. There's no actual rooted vegetation here, but you might have some phytoplankton, you might have some fish. There will still be some oxygen that's going to be given off in this area because you do have those things that are going to be in that particular zone, but you are getting to the point where things are no longer photosynthesizing. So you really don't have a lot of things that are growing as far as vegetation in this particular zone. Once you get further out into the lake or the pond, this is the bottom zone. This is the profundal zone. There is no photosynthesis at this point of the lake. This particular part of the lake is going to be the warmest part of the lake in the winter because it really is not going to be affected a tremendous amount by the climate outside of the lake. It's also going to be the coolest part of the lake during the summer because the sun can't actually get down there to warm the water up. And so this is going to be probably the most mysterious part of the lake habitat because you really can't see a whole lot about what's going on down in there, and there's really no photosynthesis actually taking place at that point. Ponds are a little bit different. Typically, they are going to be a little bit smaller. So there are a lot of people who actually have ponds on their farms, and they're used for a lot of different reasons. Most of those reasons involve watering animals, irrigation. It may involve producing fish. There are some people that have pay-to-fish operations, or they just have a pond on their property that they want to fish in just for the fun of it. Some may just leave things kind of grown up a little bit for wildlife, or they may even have it for fire protection. So there are a lot of different reasons why people might have ponds on their farm. And there's going to be different kinds of ponds too, depending on where you actually are, and we'll talk about those in just a few minutes. The USDA does say that the ideal size for a family farm pond is going to be less than 2 acres, meaning that it's not going to be an extremely large body of water, but it is enough to serve the purposes of irrigation, watering, and things like that. So if you get much bigger than that, it's going to be more difficult to manage. So it is a situation where you do need to be able to manage whatever it is that you have. Otherwise, that pond ends up growing up and becoming more of a nuisance than a benefit to the farm. The management is going to depend on whether you are establishing a new pond or whether you are working with a pond that's being renovated or that has been there for a long time. Obviously, vegetation grows on the outer edges of the pond. Evaporation happens. A pond that is not maintained can grow over. And so it kind of just depends on what you're doing with the pond, how you want to maintain it. If you are building a new pond, you want to make sure that you are very mindful about how you're caring for the pond, that you're getting the bacteria levels right, that you're building the pond in the correct way, that it's being developed the way that it ought to be. If you have existing ponds or old ponds, you probably are looking at trying to just maintain what's there and correct any situation that you have that could be a particular problem at that point. Embankment ponds are typically going to be held, or they're going to be held on one side normally by some sort of an embankment or a dam. And I'm going to show you some pictures of these, some diagrams of these in just a few minutes. But normally you do have some sort, normally this is on a slope, and you have some sort of dam on one side that's actually holding the pond from overflowing. These should be a minimum of 6 feet deep in order to make sure that you are not having issues with things growing up and you're not having issues with that vegetation. And you do want to have some sort of a permanent vegetation around that buffer strip. And you want to make sure that whatever it is that you have that is the dam or whatever embankment that you have that's holding that pond in place, you want to cover that with grass just because of erosion issues. You don't want things spilling over into your pond, and you don't want your pond to come over the dam or the embankment. So I'll show you some diagrams in just a few minutes that will help to explain this just a little bit better. The spillway itself should be 3 or more feet below the top of the dam, and you also want to have some vegetation growing on that. You don't want to have trees or shrubs that are on the dams because those roots can be damaging to what you've got there and to the structure that you actually have built. So that's one particular type of pond, an embankment pond. Another type is going to be an excavated pond, and this is where you're actually just digging a hole. Normally, this is going to be built in an area that's on level land versus what you usually see out here. Normally, in this part of the state, we have enough slope that a lot of the ponds that we have around here are embankment type ponds. And they're going to basically be built on the side of a slope, and they're going to have some dam to keep the water in place. These excavated ponds are typically going to be built in areas where the land is flat. And you can see through by this diagram right here, the first little part of this diagram shows you an excavated pond, and this literally looks like where somebody just went and dug a big hole. Probably some sort of a natural spring or something actually would have filled it up. The second one, the embankment pond, you can see you have a slope and a dam has been built on one side just to hold that water so that it doesn't actually spill over. This is what you're going to see a lot in mountainous type areas, and sometimes you may actually see a combination of the two depending on where you are and the type of situation that you're in. So when looking at these different types of ponds, it's important to think about the fact that ponds are going to be much more difficult to maintain versus something like a larger lake or river or stream or something like that that's going to be a natural phenomenon. And a lot of times these artificial ponds, you do have to spend quite a bit of time actually maintaining them. Management is going to be necessary to make sure that your pond is there for a long time. We have situations where algae can become issues, and things can be overgrown on the edges, and you may or may not have the dam built the way that it should be. So if you want to have a pond around for a long time, you are going to have to maintain it. It's just like having a pasture or any other piece of property. If you don't maintain it, then you're going to have some difficulties along the way, just like a forest or farm or any type of property. So vegetation control is important. This does help to provide food and shelter and oxygen and a place where fish and other organisms can spawn, meaning they can give birth or lay eggs or whatever it is that they do, whether they're egg layers or give live birth. It provides a nesting habitat for some of your waterfowl. So it is important to make sure you do have some vegetation, but too much can actually harm the fish and it can actually inhibit you being able to get into the pond. We had a pond that was near my house where I grew up. And I remember when I was a kid going down that road, I loved to ride by that pond because it was so pretty and it was just a nice and peaceful and kind of tranquil area on that road. It was covered, or there were trees all around it, and it was just a really nice place to ride through. And if you were to ride down the same road now, you would not see a pond or know that there had ever been one there. So that excess vegetation can become out of control. So you do want to make sure that you are careful about making sure that you are controlling those things. And there's different ways to do that. Um, you want to make sure that you are keeping the soil and the nutrients on the land and out of the water. Obviously, you're going to have a little bit of stuff in the edge of the water, but you want to make sure that you have kind of a dividing line between the two and you're keeping the vegetation out of the water. Otherwise, it becomes kind of a swampy, marshy type of area. You want to look at the water level management. This is one that can be kind of challenging if you have something like an excavated pond. That one's going to be more difficult to maintain than something like an embankment pond because the dam and the spillway can actually help to maintain water levels. Biological control, using some sort of a living organism to control aquatic plants, to eat them, basically. If you have something in there that's eating the plants, then the plants are not going to become overgrown. And there are some ways that you can use some chemical herbicides for particularly weed infested waters, but it's not something that I would recommend unless that is just a last resort type of situation, because you really don't want to be putting chemicals into those ponds that could affect the wildlife that you have living there. Um, as far as fish sampling, you do want to figure out what's living there, especially if it's a situation where you have an on farm pond and you are trying to maintain it for fishing purposes or whatever. You want to kind of keep an idea of what is actually in the water, how well they're doing. You can see these people here in this picture are actually taking a sample of the fish that are in this pond, and they can look at whether or not they have any situations going on with disease or issues like that. So this is probably the easiest way to do it, to have a big net and several people that can go and use that net to pull some of those fish out of the water and take a look at them. But you can also do some other methods as far as things like angling and spot poisoning and boat shocker. And but I would say probably the easiest thing to do is to use those nets, pull them up, take a look at them, get a sample of what's going on with the fish, and you can do a better job of keeping an eye on what you have living in your pond. As far as having a pond and these fish that are there, obviously it's just like having a patch of forest or a pasture or a yard. We all have situations where we end up having undesirable species, whether it's in our yard and we have weeds, or whether it's in our forest and we have trees that we don't want in our forest, a type of weed tree or something we don't want in our forest, or even kudzu or something like that. When we're looking at any piece of property, it can become overpopulated with things we don't want. And one method of population removal is to drain the pond and trap the fish in nets and keep what you want and get rid of what you don't want. I would say that is probably a challenging way to do it. If you really have a problem with something that is a species that you don't want, you can poison the entire pond. But I would say, again, that's probably a last resort because you are removing everything at that point. It's just like cleaning out a fish tank. If you clean out a fish tank and you take every bit of the water out, you kill good bacteria and bad bacteria. So, you're killing the good fish and the bad fish whenever you come and poison the entire lake or pond. So that's something that I would say would be a last case um, type of scenario. We wouldn't want to have to do that unless we had to. There are ways to increase fertilization in your pond, and that's a lot of times that's done in this part of the country. We do have a pretty ideal type environment for lakes and ponds because it stays fairly warm for most of the year. I mean, even our winters don't get to be terribly cold. As compared to what you see some in the northern areas, and so you do have to be careful about both vegetation control and making sure that you are fertilizing what you want to keep. 8 to 10 treatments of a commercial fertilizer is what you would typically do in a year. And this is going to increase the production of plankton, which is good for the fish because they're going to eat more. They eat more, they become more healthy, they produce more, they reproduce more. But again, you have to be careful as far as the vegetation. It is a delicate balance, making sure that you are not getting too much of an undesirable species of plant that's going to take over the edges of your pond and become a marshy or swampy type area. So you do want to be careful as far as how much you're fertilizing and what you're fertilizing for. It is a delicate ecosystem whenever you're looking at these ponds. There are fishing regulations, and I'm sure that most of you, if you took this course because that's something that you're interested in, you're probably already aware of the fishing regulations. Normally, it's based on the size and the number of the fish that are taken. And this is just to make sure that we are keeping a good balance. Not too many fish in a pond, but we are also not eliminating or endangering a species as well. Water quality, extremely important. That's something that we have started to work on in our tank in the greenhouse. Cohort A had an opportunity to take the pH reading of the tank last week. So hopefully we'll get cohort B in and show them how to do the pH of the tank as well. Typically, you want your pH of the water to be somewhere between 6.5 and 9.0. So that's close to neutral or slightly on the alkaline side. And so at this point, all the readings that we have taken of our tank that we have in the greenhouse, our aquaponics system, are around 7 to 7.5. So right now they're pretty much optimal as far as the pH that we have. We do have to kind of keep an eye on our temperature. We still have not had our heater in our greenhouse hooked up. And that's something that we've been asking for the county to do. So hopefully we'll get that done pretty soon. But I do think it's warm enough in the greenhouse right now that it's keeping the water warm enough that we're going to be okay. So hopefully we have put fertilizer in the water in order. It's an aquaponic type fertilizer in order to help the plants grow. We have also put a bacteria into the water, and so hopefully we are soon ready for fish. So we are getting our water quality under control, and it's something you also have to do in outdoor situations as well, whether you're looking at ponds or lakes or whatever. So next time we will look at a few types of freshwater species. And to be honest, I'm probably not going to spend a tremendous amount of time going over a lot of these species because it's a picture and a diagram. So for this particular thing, you'll probably just be going in and looking at the different types of species. However, we will be doing some Kahoots in class for those of you that are cohort A or B to see just how well you know your different species of fish. We'll start with freshwater fish, and then next week we will be looking at oceans and saltwater fish. So you can definitely tell that I'm at school filming this video, but I am done for the day, and make sure that you take a look at those freshwater fish species that are on the next page and check out what's there. See you guys next time. Take care.